under the silk-draped domes of the Ottoman Palace. Behind doors, no man was meant to cross. Power did not always belong to sultans. It whispered instead through corridors guarded by men without families, without descendants, without mercy. Men who could enter places where even princes were forbidden. Men who heard every secret, touched every seal, and sometimes decided who would live and who would vanish before dawn. On a quiet night in Istanbul, a single order could move from the harem to the throne room without passing through the hands of a vizier or a general. It traveled through the eunuchs. To understand the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lasting empires in human history, you must step inside its most forbidden space. Not the battlefield, not the council chamber, but the harem. The word itself has been misunderstood for centuries. In European imagination, the harem was a place of idle pleasure. Endless women reclining on cushions, waiting for the sultan's desire. In reality, it was one of the most tightly controlled, politically charged institutions in the empire. A world of hierarchy, discipline, fear, ambition and surveillance. And standing at its gates were the youth. They were castrated boys, taken from distant lands, Africa, the Caucasus, the Balkans, cut off from lineage and legacy, then rebuilt into instruments of absolute loyalty. Or so the system believed. Because what the Ottomans truly created was not obedience, but an entirely new elite. One that answered to no family, commanded no army, yet could bend the empire's fate with a whispered sentence. At the heart of this system stood the Chief Black Eunuch, the Kızlar Ağası. He controlled access to the Imperial Harem, oversaw the women who would give birth to future sultans, managed enormous charitable foundations, and served as a direct channel between the private world of the palace and the public machinery of state. His power was so vast that foreign ambassadors feared him, viziers courted him, princes depended on him, because in the Ottoman system, succession was not guaranteed by birth order. It was decided by survival. When a sultan died, his sons did not inherit peacefully. They raced. Whoever reached Istanbul first and secured the support of key power brokers became ruler. The losers were often strangled with a silk cord, their deaths recorded as necessity, not murder. And the eunuchs were always watching. They raised the princes inside the palace. They monitored their behavior. They delivered messages between mothers and sons. They decided who could speak to whom, who received information, and who remained isolated in silence. A prince could grow up believing he was favored, only to discover too late that the eunuchs had already shifted their loyalty elsewhere. One eunuch's nod could open a door. Another's silence could end a life. But their story does not begin in power. It begins in pain. Most eunuchs entered the empire as children, captured through trade routes that connected the Ottoman world to Africa and beyond. Castration was brutal, often fatal. Those who survived were trained relentlessly, taught languages, etiquette, religion, and court politics. Their bodies were marked forever, but their minds were sharpened for survival. In a society built on lineage, eunuchs were anomalies. They could not form dynasties. They could not pass on wealth or titles. And precisely because of this, the Ottomans trusted them. A eunuch had no son to crown, no family to enrich, only the palace to serve. Or so the theory went. In practice, eunuchs built networks as powerful as any noble house. They sponsored protégés, controlled appointments, and accumulated fortunes through gifts, bribes, and control of religious endowments. Some became patrons of mosques and schools across the empire, their names carved into stone long after their bodies were gone. One Chief Black Eunuch in the 17th century controlled so much wealth that European observers described him as a king behind the veil. He decided which harem women received the sultan's attention, which mothers gained influence, and which princes were quietly pushed aside. Because, in the Ottoman palace, the most dangerous weapon was not the sword, it was access. The harem was not merely a residence for women, it was a training ground for future rulers, mothers. A political arena where alliances were formed through whispers and glances. A favored concubine could become the valid sultan, the queen mother, one of the most powerful figures in the empire. And once she reached that position, her authority often eclipsed that of the Grand Vizier himself. But she did not act alone. The eunuchs were her eyes and ears. They carried her orders. They filtered information. They blocked rivals. During periods later known as the Sultanate of Women, eunuchs and queen mothers effectively ran the empire, while sultans were children, weak or disinterested. Wars were declared. Officials were appointed. Executions were ordered all from behind the harem walls. European diplomats were baffled. They sent reports home describing an empire ruled not by soldiers, but by women and castrated men hidden from public view. Many dismissed these accounts as exhibitions. Others realized, too late, that they were dangerously accurate. One ambassador wrote that to influence the Ottoman court, it was more effective to bribe a eunuch than to flatter a vizier. Another warned that offending the chief eunuch could end negotiations overnight. Yet, despite their power, eunuchs lived in constant danger. They were indispensable, but never fully trusted. A single accusation, true or false, could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. Sultans, who felt threatened by palace intrigue, sometimes purged eunuchs en masse. Fortunes vanished overnight. Allies became executioners. And still, men competed desperately to reach these positions. Because for a boy who had lost everything, family, future, body, the palace offered something extraordinary: significance, influence, a voice that could shape the destiny of millions. The forbidden harem was not silent. It was humming with calculation, fear, desire, and ambition. And the eunuchs stood at its center, balancing between absolute authority and absolute vulnerability. Because once you step fully inside the harem, you begin to see the empire not as a realm of sultans but as a machine powered by those history tried to erase. The corridor was narrow, deliberately so. Two men could not walk side by side. Its walls absorbed sound, and its turns concealed whoever waited beyond them. This passage connected the inner chambers of the harem to the outer court of power, and it belonged entirely to the eunuchs. In Topkapı Palace, architecture was politics made stone. Every gate marked a boundary. Every threshold required permission. And every permission passed through hands that were never meant to hold power. By the late 16th century, a quiet transformation had taken place inside the Ottoman court. The old balanceware, white eunuchs from the Balkans guarded the outer palace, and black eunuchs from Africa served inside, had begun to shift. Gradually, deliberately, the black eunuchs moved closer to the center, closer to the women, closer to the princes, closer to the sultan himself. This was not accidental. White eunuchs, often recruited through the Devshirme system, had roots in the empire's Christian provinces. Many spoke multiple European languages. Some retained family connections beyond the palace walls. They had influence, but also options. Black eunuchs had none. Taken largely from sub-Saharan Africa, cut off from homeland and kin, they were perceived as utterly dependent on the palace. And so the Ottomans entrusted them with what mattered most: the continuity of the dynasty. The Chief Black Eunuch did not merely guard the harem. He controlled its internal economy. He supervised education, discipline, punishment. He approved correspondence between the women and the outside world. He decided which message reached a sultan's ear and which one disappeared into silence. And messages mattered. A single sentence, carefully timed, could change everything. A whisper that a concubine was pregnant. A suggestion that a prince was ill-tempered. A warning that a vizier was plotting. Information flowed through the eunuchs like blood through veins. Stop it, redirect it, poison at hand. The body of the empire responded. One story, recorded by Ottoman chroniclers, tells of a young prince confined to the palace's inner apartments. He was clever, observant, and deeply anxious. His older brother was favored by powerful factions. The prince knew that if his brother ascended the throne, his own death was likely. He did not appeal to generals. He could not reach ministers. He turned instead to a eunuch who supervised his daily routine. Over months, gifts were exchanged. Trust was built. Complaints were shared. Eventually, a message reached the prince's mother. Then another reached a powerful harem woman. Then, quietly, the narrative around the favored brother began to change. By the time the sultan died, the favored prince was described as unstable, dangerous, unfit. The younger prince ascended the throne. The eunuch was rewarded with wealth, authority, and silence. This is how power worked in the Ottoman harem. Not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Influence layered upon influence until outcomes felt inevitable. Yet, the eunuchs themselves lived under constant scrutiny. They slept inside the palace, often in cramped quarters, under rules stricter than those applied to many soldiers. They were forbidden from forming families, yet they built emotional bonds, sometimes with each other, sometimes with the women they served, sometimes with the children they raised, and these bonds complicated everything. Contrary to myth, the harem was not a place of unthinking obedience. It was a society. Women competed fiercely for status, security, and survival. Mothers fought for their sons' futures. Rival factions formed and collapsed. Eunuchs became mediators, confidants, and sometimes conspirators. One chief eunuch was said to know the moods of every major harem figure better than they knew each other. He could sense a shift in loyalty before it was spoken aloud. He could smell danger in a glance. And yet, he himself could fall just as swiftly. When Sultan Murad IV seized power in the early 17th century, he was determined to end palace manipulation. He distrusted the harem, despised the influence of women, and feared the eunuchs. During his reign, several high-ranking eunuchs were executed or exiled, accused of corruption or treachery. But even Murad could not rule without them, because the harem did not disappear. It waited. After his death, the system reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. Child sultans came to the throne. Regents ruled, and once again, eunuchs stood beside queen mothers, guiding the empire from behind veils and curtains. European observers struggled to understand this world. They searched for power in councils and armies, while it moved quietly through servants' corridors. They mocked the idea of castrated men wielding authorities, till treaties failed, ambassadors were expelled, and wars erupted based on decisions made inside rooms they could never enter. One French diplomat admitted, reluctantly, that negotiations often hinged on the goodwill of a man no one is permitted to see. But the greatest contradiction of all was this. The eunuchs were both slaves and masters. Legally, many were enslaved. Socially, they outranked free men. A provincial governor might command thousands of troops, yet bow deeply to a palace eunuch, whose word could end his career. Wealth flowed upward through these mangold land, favors yet none of it could secure what most humans crave: legacy. No sons would remember them, no daughters would pray for them. Their names might be carved into stone, but their bloodlines ended with them, and so they sought immortality in other ways, through patronage, through buildings, through influence that outlived their bodies. Mosques rose bearing eunuchs' names. Schools educated generations, funded by their endowments. In some neighborhoods of Istanbul, the most prominent religious foundations were controlled not by scholars or nobles, but by palace eunuchs, whose power extended far beyond the harem walls. Yet even stone could not protect them from fear, because the closer one stood to the center of power, the more dangerous the fall. A new sultan meant new loyalties. A new queen mother meant old allies discarded. Eunuchs learned to read transitions with almost supernatural precision, backed the wrong faction, and decades of influence vanished overnight. Some adapted, others miscalculated. There are records of chief eunuchs who ended their lives in exile, stripped of authority, watching the empire continue without them. Men who once decided succession reduced to footnotes, their names surviving only in court registers. Still, generation after generation, boys were brought into the system. The pain continued, the machine endured, because the Ottoman Empire, for all its armies and banners, relied on something far more fragile and terrifying: absolute control over access, secrecy, and trust. And the eunuchs cut, conditioned, and confined became its most efficient guardians. In the next part, we will move deeper into the harem itself, into the daily routines, the hidden rivalries, and the intimate power struggles that defined life behind the forbidden doors, and reveal why the harem was never a prison, but a battlefield without weapons. Morning inside the harem did not begin with sunlight. It began with sound. Soft footsteps on polished stone. The faint rustle of fabric. The low, deliberate voice of a eunuch announcing the hour. Time in the harem was not measured by clocks alone, but by permission. When to wake, when to eat, when to speak, when to remain silent. For the women inside, life was a continuous negotiation between discipline and ambition. For the eunuchs, it was vigilance without rest. Every day followed a ritualized order that hid constant tension beneath its surface. Young concubines were trained relentlessly language, music, etiquette, religion. They were not taught to seduce. They were taught to survive. A careless word, an unguarded expression, could mark someone as a liability, and liabilities did not last long. Eunuchs observed everything. They noticed which woman received extra attention from instructors, which one lingered too long in corridors, which mother's chambers were suddenly more active at night. Nothing was trivial. Patterns mattered more than actions, because pregnancy changed everything. A concubine who bore a son ceased to be merely a woman of the harem. She became a political actor. Her status rose instantly, and so did the danger around her. Rival women might sabotage her. Others might align with her. And hovering above it all were the eunuchs, determining what information reached whom. If a pregnancy was hidden for even a few days, it could alter the balance of power. If a miscarriage occurred, the narrative surrounding it could be accident, illness, or quiet suspicion of intervention. Eunuchs controlled these stories. They controlled the timing. They controlled the witnesses. This is why they were feared. A eunuch could elevate a woman by ensuring she was seen, or erase her by ensuring she was not. Doors open, doors stayed closed. That his discretion. And inside a palace where movement defined destiny, that discretion was absolute. One chronicler recorded the fall of a once favored concubine who had offended a senior eunuch with careless arrogance. She laughed at him, dismissing his authority. Within weeks, her access to tutors was reduced. Messages to the Sultan were delayed. Invitations vanished. She never saw the Sultan again. Her name disappears from the record shortly after. The harem was often described as a prison, but prisons have walls meant to contain. The harem's walls were meant to protect something far more valuable, the bloodline of the dynasty, and protection required control. Eunuchs enforced that control with precision. They punished disobedience. They mediated disputes. They rewarded loyalty. But they also listened. Always listened. In the evenings, when lamps flickered and the palace settled into uneasy calm, secrets flowed more freely. A woman confided her fears. A prince complained of neglect. A mother wept over her son's future. The eunuchs heard it all, and they remembered. Memory was their greatest weapon. They stored grievances, favors, promises, insults. Years later, a forgotten kindness could be repaid. A careless slight could return at the worst possible moment. Yet, not all eunuchs were villains lurking in shadows. Many genuinely believed in the system. They took pride in discipline. They saw themselves as guardians of stability in an empire where chaos could erupt overnight. Some formed deep bonds with the children they raised. Princes grew up, surrounded by women and eunuchs, often isolated from the outside world. They learned early that trust was conditional, that affection could vanish, that survival required caution. For many princes, a eunuch was the closest thing to a constant presence, a tutor, a protector, sometimes even a surrogate parent. This relationship shaped rulers. Sultans raised in confinement, watched from birth, often emerged paranoid, suspicious, or withdrawn. Others learned to manipulate just as skillfully as those who raised them. They observed the eunuchs as closely as the eunuchs observed them. A clever prince learned when to speak, when to listen, and whom to flatter. He learned that the path to the throne did not begin on a battlefield, but in whispered alliances formed years before power was within reach. Some princes failed to learn this. Those who ignored palace politics often paid with their lives. The system was ruthless, but efficient. For centuries, it prevented the kind of civil wars that had torn apart other empires. Succession was brutal, but brief. Stability followed bloodshed, and the eunuchs were its engineers. But there was a cost. As the centuries passed, the balance of power inside the palace shifted further inward. The military elite grew restless. Provincial governors resented decisions made by invisible figures. Religious scholars questioned the morality of rule shaped by women and castrated men. Tensions simmered. By the 18th century, whispers of corruption grew louder. Accusations that eunuchs were selling offices, manipulating justice, enriching themselves beyond reason. Some of these accusations were exaggerated, others were undeniable. Power, once concentrated, rarely remains clean. One chief black eunuch became infamous for his control over appointments across the empire. Governors paid enormous sums for his favor. Judges owed their careers to his nod. He lived in opulence that rivaled princes, surrounded by servants and luxury. And then, abruptly, he fell. A new sultan ascended. A new faction rose. The eunuch's allies vanished. He was accused of crimes he could neither deny nor defend against. He was exiled, stripped of wealth, left to fade from memory. No trial, no public explanation, just silence. This was the unspoken rule of the harem. Power was total, but never permanent. Even at their height, eunuchs knew they stood on unstable ground. Their authority depended entirely on proximity to the throne. Lose that proximity, and they became ghosts alive, but irrelevant. Yet despite the danger, the system endured, because it was adaptable. When sultans grew stronger, eunuchs receded. When sultans weakened, eunuchs advanced, always adjusting, always surviving. In the next part, we will follow the eunuchs beyond the palace walls, into diplomacy, religion, and imperial finance, to reveal how men forbidden from public life quietly shaped the Ottoman world, far beyond the harem, leaving fingerprints on history few ever noticed. Beyond the palace gates, the city of Istanbul pulsed with trade, prayer, and rumor. Minarets pierced the sky. Ships crowded the Golden Horn. Markets overflowed with voices from 3 continents. To the public eye, the empire was ruled from mosques, barracks, and council halls, but many of the decisions shaping that world had already been made elsewhere inside rooms no outsider would ever see, because the eunuchs did not stop at the harem walls. Officially, they were servants of the inner palace, forbidden from public authority. Unofficially, they were among the most influential figures in Ottoman society. Through religious endowments, diplomatic channels, and financial networks, eunuchs extended their reach across the empire. The key was control of the historical foundations. These endowments funded mosques, schools, hospitals, soup kitchens, and roads. They were essential to daily life, especially in cities, and many of the most lucrative vakifs fell under the supervision of the Chief Black Eunuch, whose authority included oversight of holy sites in Mecca and Medina. This alone elevated his status beyond imagination. The man who controlled the harem also controlled the flow of money to Islam's holiest places. He appointed officials, approved budgets, and managed pilgrim logistics. Governors across the empire deferred to him not because he commanded armies, but because he controlled legitimacy. To offend the chief eunuch was to risk being cut off from religious prestige. Foreign rulers understood this quickly. Ambassadors sent gifts not only to the sultan and viziers, but to eunuchs whose favor could unlock stalled negotiations. A delayed audience, a missing document, a rumor whispered at the wrong moment. Diplomacy lived and died in these margins. One Venetian envoy complained bitterly that weeks of careful negotiation were undone by a single palace eunuch who took offense at a phrase no one else remembered. His report concluded with a warning: ignore the eunuchs and the empire becomes unreadable. And yet, to the public, eunuchs remained invisible. They rarely appeared in official portraits. Their names were often omitted from grand histories. Chroniclers wrote cautiously about them, aware that too much honesty could be dangerous. Even today, their stories survive mostly in fragments, letters, court records, foreign accounts, never in the heroic language reserved for generals and sultans. This invisibility was not accidental. Eunuchs were powerful precisely because they were unseen. They did not rule openly. They shaped outcomes quietly. They did not issue decrees. They ensured the right decree reached the right hands. In many ways, they resembled modern intelligence operatives more than medieval courtiers. But power leaves scars. As eunuchs accumulated wealth and influence, resentment grew. Janissaries muttered about palace corruption. Religious scholars warned that moral decay was eating away at the empire's core. Pamphlets circulated, accusing eunuchs of greed, manipulation, and sacrilege. Sometimes these accusations turned violent. During periods of unrest, eunuchs became convenient targets. Rioters stormed palace gates, demanding executions. Sultans, desperate to restore order, sacrificed key eunuchs to appease the crowd. Heads rolled, power shifted, the machine reset, and still, it endured. Because the Ottoman system was not built on trust. It was built on balance. Every institution checked another. When the military grew too strong, the palace reasserted itself. When palace intrigue threatened stability, force intervened. Eunuchs were one part of that equilibrium, feared, resented, indispensable. Yet for all their influence, they remained profoundly alone. They lived among people, but apart from them. They shaped families, but had none of their own. They raised princes, only to be discarded once those princes ruled. Some sultans honored the eunuchs who had protected them. Others eliminated them immediately, eager to sever old dependencies. There are accounts of eunuchs who wept openly upon the accession of a former pupil out of pride, fear, or both, because a new sultan's first act was often to ask a single question: who truly holds power here? The answer determined who survived the transition. As the 19th century approached, the Ottoman Empire began to change under immense pressure. European powers encroached, reforms were introduced, bureaucracy expanded. The old palace system creaked under the weight of modernity. The harem did not disappear overnight, but its influence waned. New ministries replaced informal channels. New laws limited arbitrary power. Eunuchs found their roles shrinking, their authority questioned, their relevance fading. Some adapted, becoming administrators. Others resisted. Many were quietly retired. When the empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, the harem dissolved. The palace became a museum. The corridors fell silent. Visitors today walk those halls freely, unaware of how much bloodless power once flowed through them. The eunuchs left no descendants to tell their stories. No family legends. No inherited titles. What remains is an uncomfortable truth. The Ottoman Empire, so often remembered for sultans, conquests, and battles, was also shaped by men, stripped of everything except proximity to power. Men whose bodies were broken so the dynasty could survive. Men who turned exclusion into influence. Inside the forbidden harem, the eunuchs ran Ottoman power not because they were chosen to rule, but because they were the only ones who could move freely between worlds that were never meant to meet. And in that space between silence and authority, they changed history without ever standing in the light. Even after their power faded, the shadow of the eunuchs lingered. Long after the last Chief Black Eunuch left Topkapı Palace, long after the last harem doors were unlocked for the public, the habits they created continued to shape how the Ottoman state remembered itself. Because systems outlive the people who run them. And secrecy, once normalized, does not vanish easily. In the final decades of the empire, reformers spoke of modernization, transparency, rational government. They drafted constitutions and reorganized ministries. They imported European models of administration. Yet again and again, old instincts resurfaced, decisions made privately, influence exercised quietly, loyalty valued over legality. These were the echoes of a palace culture refined over centuries. The eunuchs had mastered a truth that every empire eventually learns: the most decisive power is rarely the most visible. It hides in access, timing, and trust. It operates where formal authority hesitates. And this truth was born inside the harem. For centuries, the harem functioned as the emotional and biological heart of the empire. It produced heirs. It shaped rulers. It absorbed the anxieties of succession and turned them into strategy. Eunuchs, positioned at its core, became the translators between fear and policy. They understood something even the sultans sometimes forgot. Empires do not fall only to enemies. They collapse from uncertainty at the center. Every whispered rumor about a prince's health, every doubt cast on a mother's loyalty, every delay in communication could destabilize the state. Eunuchs were trained to manage this volatility, to contain panic, redirect ambition, and, when necessary, eliminate threats quietly. The cost of failure was catastrophe. Consider the alternative. Without eunuchs, The harem would have been a closed universe, disconnected from governance. Without them, women would have lacked channels to assert influence, leading to open conflict. Without them, princes would have grown isolated, unprepared, or rebellious. The eunuchs were the conduits that prevented explosion. This does not make them benevolent. It makes them necessary. History often demands uncomfortable truths. The Ottoman Empire was not run solely by enlightened rulers or iron-fisted generals. It was sustained by systems that inflicted suffering to maintain order. The eunuchs were among the most extreme examples of this logic: human sacrifices to stability. And yet, within that cruelty, they exercised agency. They were not passive victims forever frozen at the moment of their mutilation. They learned, adapted, and maneuvered. Some became ruthless, others became cautious. A few attempted to soften the system from within, protecting certain women, delaying executions, shielding children. These moments rarely appear in official records. Mercy leaves fewer documents than violence, but they mattered to those who lived through them. There are scattered accounts of eunuchs who warned princes of impending danger, who hid messages, who slowed processes just enough to save a life. These actions were never celebrated. They were never rewarded publicly, but they revealed the human complexity behind the institution. Because even within a machine built on control, individuals still made choices. The greatest irony of all is this: the eunuchs were forbidden intimacy, yet they were entrusted with the most intimate aspects of power: birth, upbringing, desire, fear, death. They watched children learn to speak and men learn to kill. They stood beside women who would become legends and others who would vanish without trace. They witnessed love, jealousy, devotion, and betrayal at a proximity few rulers ever experienced, and they carried these memories alone. When a chief eunuch died, his possessions were often confiscated, his papers destroyed, his influence erased. The empire did not want reminders of how much it had relied on those it pretended did not matter. But history remembers in fragments, in a mosque inscription here, in a diplomatic complaint there, in a chronicler's careful phrasing. Slowly, reluctantly, the outline emerges: an empire guarded by men who could never inherit it. A dynasty protected by those excluded from its bloodline. A system that trusted eunuchs precisely because it feared everyone else. The forbidden harem was never just a private space. It was a command center, and the eunuchs were never merely guards. They were architects of continuity in a world terrified of collapse. So when visitors walk through Topkapı Palace today, admiring tiled walls and silent courtyards, they walk through a place once alive with calculation. Every doorframe was a checkpoint, every hallway a filter, every silence a decision. And somewhere in that silence stood a eunuch, listening. Not because history placed him there by accident, but because the Ottoman Empire, for all its grandeur, could not survive without men who lived entirely in the shadows. This is not a story of villains or heroes. It is a story of power, how it moves, how it hides, and how often it depends on those history tries hardest to forget. Yet, there is one final layer to this story, one that makes the existence of the eunuchs not only a political phenomenon, but a psychological one. Because the harem did not merely produce rulers, it produced fear. Fear of replacement, fear of erasure, fear that someone, somewhere, knew something you did not. The eunuchs lived inside that fear and learned to weaponize it. A sultan could command armies, but even he could not see everything. He relied on intermediaries, on voices that filtered reality before it reached him. And once a ruler accepts that filtered reality, control quietly shifts. A eunuch did not need to lie outright. He could delay a report, emphasize one detail, omit another, frame a situation just enough to shape perception. The sultan believed he was acting independently, ever fully aware that his information had already been curated. This subtlety is why eunuchs survived rulers who were otherwise ruthless. Sultans executed viziers publicly. They crushed janissaries. They purged religious factions. But eunuchs were harder to remove. Their power was too embedded, too intangible. Remove one, and another stepped forward, already holding the keys. And the keys were literal. Keys to rooms, keys to gates, keys to chests, keys to knowledge. Inside the harem, locked doors were not symbols, they were tools. A locked door meant safety for one person and doom for another. Eunuchs controlled those thresholds with precision. They decided who waited, who entered, who never returned. There are Ottoman court cases describing men who vanished after requesting an audience that never came. No execution record, no easy decree, simply absence. The palace swallowed them, and the eunuchs remained. This environment shaped everyone within it. Women learned to speak indirectly. Princes learned to conceal ambition. Sultans learned to suspect loyalty, even in those closest to them. The harem was not decadent, it was paranoid, and paranoia was rational. Because history had taught the Ottomans a brutal lesson. Civil war was worse than tyranny. Fragmentation was worse than cruelty. If control required silence, then silence became policy. Eunuchs enforced that silence. But silence takes a toll. Many eunuchs turned inward as they aged. Some became intensely religious, funding mosques and pilgrimages as if trying to balance unseen scales. Others grew bitter, convinced the empire owed them everything and repaid them nothing. A few clung to power with increasing desperation, terrified of becoming irrelevant. Old age was especially cruel. A young eunuch had usefulness. An old eunuch had memory sand. Memories could be dangerous. Sultans sometimes removed elderly eunuchs, not for crimes, but for knowledge. They knew too much about past alliances, about past murders, about who truly ruled when the throne was weak. Exile was mercy. Execution was finality. And still, the system persisted. What makes the eunuchs extraordinary is not that they held power, but that the empire built a structure that required them. This was not an accident of personality. It was a design choice, refined over centuries. Remove the eunuchs, and the harem collapses into chaos. Remove the harem, and succession fractures. Remove controlled succession, and the empire bleeds itself to death. The eunuchs were the keystone in an arch no one wanted to acknowledge. Modern observers often ask, why would an empire entrust so much authority to men stripped of family and future? The answer is uncomfortable. Because people without a future are often the most invested in the present. Eunuchs could not imagine life beyond the palace. Their entire existence depended on its survival. Their loyalty was not ideological, was existential. If the system fell, they fell with it. And so they defended it ferociously. They defended it against outsiders, against internal rivals, and sometimes against the Sultan himself by guiding him, restraining him, or subtly correcting him. This is why European powers never fully understood the Ottoman court. They looked for kings and councils. They missed the gatekeepers, and gatekeepers always matter. When the empire finally ended, no one held funerals for the eunuchs as a class. No monuments marked their collective passing. Their disappearance was quiet, almost deliberate. History prefers clean narratives, but the truth is messier. The Ottoman Empire was not only a story of conquest and decline, it was a story of managed fear, controlled access, and power exercised by those erased from the public image of rule. The eunuchs were not a footnote, they were infrastructure. And like all infrastructure, they were invisible. They were gone. Only then did it become clear how much had been built upon them. So when we speak of forbidden spaces, we should not imagine pleasure or indulgence. We should imagine calculation. We should imagine men standing still for hours, listening through walls, measuring the weight of a single sentence. We should imagine a world where power did not roar, it whispered, and the eunuchs were the ones who decided who heard it. And whispers, once released, never truly disappear. They echo through institutions, shaping habits long after the original voices fall silent. Even in the final years of the Ottoman Empire, when railways cut through provinces and telegraphs compressed distance to logic, of the harem still lingered in how power was handled. Decisions were delayed until the right intermediary approved them. Access mattered more than arguments. Proximity outweighed merit. This was the legacy of centuries in which eunuchs had taught the empire how to govern without appearing to govern. Yet for all their influence, there is one question history keeps circling back to. Did the eunuchs believe in what they were doing? The answer is not singular. Some saw themselves as guardians of order, convinced that without their intervention, the dynasty would descend into chaos. They had witnessed succession crises firsthand, brothers strangled, mothers exiled, entire factions erased overnight. To them, manipulation was mercy, control was compassion. If bending truth saved the empire, then truth was a luxury the state could not afford. Others were more pragmatic. Power, once tasted, reshapes morality. A eunuch, who began as a frightened boy, learned quickly that survival depended on relevance. To remain useful was to remain alive. And relevance required influence. Influence required action. There was no neutral ground. The harem did not allow spectators. Every eunuch, from the lowest gatekeeper to the Chief Black Eunuch himself, participated in the same unspoken bargain. Serve the system, and the system will give you meaning. Question it, and it will erase you. This bargain shaped personalities. Many eunuchs became masters of emotional restraint. They learned to speak softly, to listen more than they spoke, to reveal nothing of their inner thoughts. Anger was dangerous. Joy was suspicious. Attachment was a liability. Yet complete detachment was impossible. They grew attached to routines, to spaces, to the rhythms of palace life, the sound of the call to prayer echoing through courtyards, the familiar footfalls of trusted colleagues, the subtle shifts in atmosphere that signaled danger or opportunity. The palace became their entire universe, which makes their ultimate fate all the more striking. When the empire ended, when the sultanate was abolished and the palace emptied, the eunuchs did not resist. There was no uprising, no last stand, no dramatic confrontation. They faded. Some were pensioned quietly. Others were dismissed with nothing. A few remained as caretakers, watching tourists wander through rooms that once decided the fate of continents. Men who had once controlled access to emperors now sold trinkets or lived anonymously on the margins of a new republic that wanted nothing to do with their past. This was perhaps the final cruelty of the system. It gave eunuchs identity only within itself. Once removed, they were no one. And yet, in fading, they left behind something enduring. They proved that power does not always belong to those who appear powerful. That empires are not sustained only by armies and laws, but by invisible structures of trust and fear. That the most consequential actors are often those history tries hardest to ignore. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Harem were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a political culture obsessed with control, terrified of fragmentation, and willing to sacrifice human bodies to preserve continuity. If this story feels unsettling, it should, because it forces us to confront the reality we still live with today. Systems often elevate those who are least visible, least accountable, and most embedded. Gatekeepers still shape outcomes. Intermediaries still decide who is heard. Information is still filtered before it reaches the top. The Ottoman eunuchs remind us that power does not need a crown. It needs access. So when we imagine the past, let us resist the temptation to simplify it into heroes and villains. Let us instead recognize the machinery beneath the spectacle, the quiet figures who kept it running, the human cost of stability. Inside the forbidden harem, the eunuchs did not merely run Ottoman power. They revealed how power truly works, not in the open, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, where silence speaks louder than command. And those who are never meant to rule often decide everything. And that is why, centuries later, their story still matters. There is a final, unsettling realization that emerges when we follow the eunuchs all the way to the end of their story. They were never meant to be remembered. The Ottoman system did not design them to leave a legacy. It designed them to be functional, replaceable, and ultimately disposable. Their greatest success was invisibility, and invisibility is the enemy of memory. Sultans commissioned chronicles, celebrating victories. Viziers sponsored poets. Generals had their battles carved into stone. Eunuchs left behind corridors, routines, habits of silence, the things that endure without names. And yet, history cannot fully erase them, because too much of the empire ran through their hands. Every imperial birth they supervised. Every succession crisis they managed. Every secret they carried and never spoke. These moments accumulated, quietly shaping outcomes that textbooks still struggle to explain. Why did one prince survive while another vanished? Why did one woman rise to rule while another disappeared from the record? Why did reforms stall, advance, or collapse without clear cause? Again and again, the trail leads back to the same place. Who could enter? Who could speak? Who could wait? These were the real levers of Ottoman power, and eunuchs controlled them with relentless discipline. What makes their story difficult is not that they wielded power, but that they did so without legitimacy. They had no divine right, no legal mandate, no public accountability. Their authority existed in the cracks between institutions. That kind of power is deeply uncomfortable to confront because it feels familiar. Modern states insist on transparency, yet decision-making still concentrates around those who control information. Corporate empires rise and fall based on advisors no one elects. Governments rely on intermediaries who shape outcomes without appearing on ballots or podiums. The eunuchs were an early, extreme version of this reality. They remind us that when systems grow complex, power migrates away from symbols and toward mechanisms, away from thrones and toward thresholds. And thresholds are always guarded. For the Ottoman Empire, those guards were men whose lives had been violently redirected into service. Men who turned exclusion into leverage. Men who lived and died inside walls built to protect others. It is tempting to reduce them to monsters or martyrs. Both interpretations are comforting. Both are incomplete. The eunuchs were not villains plotting in darkness for pleasure. Nor were they saints enduring suffering with purity. They were human beings shaped by a system that rewarded silence, punished vulnerability, and equated control with survival. They adapted because adaptation was the only path left to them. In doing so, they became indispensable. And that is the final irony. The Ottoman Empire trusted eunuchs because they were stripped of family, sexuality, and lineage. It depended on them to manage birth, succession, and legacy. It feared bloodlines, yet relied on those who had none. This contradiction never resolved. It only endured until the empire itself could no longer endure. When the last sultan left Istanbul, when the harem doors were finally opened, when the palace became a relic instead of a command center, the eunuch's world ended not with violence, but with irrelevance. No one asked them what they knew. No one recorded what they remembered. No one wanted the truth of how power had really worked, because that truth was too revealing. It showed that the empire's greatest strength, its ability to control succession, suppress chaos, and centralize authority, came at the cost of extreme human sacrifice, not just on battlefields, but in bodies altered, lives constrained, and identities erased. Inside the forbidden harem, power was never free. It was paid for in silence, and the eunuchs paid the highest price of all, not because they lost something, but because they were never allowed to regain it. So when we tell the story of the Ottoman Empire, we must look beyond banners and battles. We must listen for the quieter forces, the ones that rarely announce themselves, because history is not only shaped by those who rule, it is shaped by those who decide who gets close enough to rule at all. And perhaps that is where this story must slow down, at the edge of something unresolved. Because even after everything we have traced, there remains a silence that no archive can fully break. The eunuchs left behind records of transactions, appointments, endowments. They left stone and paper, but they did not leave diaries. They did not leave confessions. We do not hear their inner voices. What did it feel like to stand between a mother and her son's execution order? What did it feel like to raise a child knowing you might later deliver the message that ended his life? What did it feel like to hold the trust of emperors while knowing that trust could turn lethal overnight? History can describe their actions, but it cannot fully reach their minds. And yet, we can infer something from the structure they sustained. The Ottoman palace was designed to prevent emotional transparency. Feelings were dangerous. Attachments were liabilities. Even love, when it appeared, was filtered through caution. The eunuchs, more than anyone else, embodied this discipline. They became experts in controlled emotion. They learned how to care without revealing care, how to advise without appearing to guide, how to protect without claiming credit, how to punish without appearing cruel. This emotional restraint was not natural. It was learned under pressure. And once learned, it rarely left them. Some historians have suggested that eunuchs were uniquely suited to palace politics because they existed outside the usual masculine codes of honor that drove rash decisions. They did not duel. They did not boast. They did not stake their worth on public recognition. Their battles were internal and strategic. This made them frighteningly effective. Where a general might react to insult, a eunuch waited. Where a vizier might overreach, a eunuch withdrew. Where others sought visibility, eunuchs sought indispensability. And indispensability is the most durable form of power. Yet even that power had limits. Eunuchs could shape succession, but they could not rule openly. They could influence sultans, but they could not replace them. They could protect the system, but they could not reform it fundamentally. In moments of deep crisis, military collapse, economic breakdown, popular revolt, their tools failed. Whispered influence could not stop cannons. Controlled access could not halt rebellion. Silence could not feed cities. When the empire began to lose wars decisively, the palace world lost relevance. Armies mattered again. Industrial power mattered. International diplomacy shifted beyond palace corridors into ministries and parliaments. The eunuchs were masters of an older world, and that world was ending. What followed was not justice, but forgetting. The new Ottoman reformers, and later the founders of the Turkish Republic, had no interest in preserving the memory of palace eunuchs. They represented everything reform sought to escape: secrecy, absolutism, inherited power, unaccountable influence. So they were written out, not violently, not dramatically, simply excluded from the new narrative. Museums spoke of architecture. Guidebooks spoke of sultans. School books spoke of reformers and revolutionaries. The eunuchs became curiosities, at best exotic footnotes, stripped of political significance. But power does not vanish when we stop naming it. It only changes form. The story of the eunuchs forces us to confront a disturbing continuity across time. That every complex system creates intermediaries, and intermediaries accumulate power. Whether they are courtiers, advisors, bureaucrats, or gatekeepers of information, the logic remains the same. Those who control access shape outcomes. The Ottoman eunuchs were extreme because the system that created them was extreme. But the principle they reveal is universal. And that is why their story endures. Not because of scandal, not because of cruelty alone, but because they expose something timeless about governance. Empires do not collapse only when enemies breach their borders. They collapse when their internal machinery no longer adapts. The eunuchs were one of the most adaptive elements of the Ottoman state until adaptation itself became impossible. In their rise and fall, we see both the brilliance and the brutality of imperial survival. So when we imagine the Forbidden Harem, let us imagine it not as fantasy, but as infrastructure. A place where power was distilled into its most concentrated form. Where bodies were sacrificed so the state could endure. Where silence was not emptiness, but policy. And at the center of that silence stood men history tried to forget, men who never ruled, yet made rule possible. The eunuchs of the Ottoman harem did not inherit the empire. They carried it until it could no longer be carried at all. And when something has been carried for too long, by too few, under too much weight, it does not collapse all at once. It fractures. In the final years before the empire's end, the palace still stood. The rituals continued. Prayers were said. Titles were spoken. But the inner logic that had once made the system function was hollowing out. The harem still existed, but it no longer decided the future. The eunuchs still guarded doors, but fewer people needed to pass through them. Power had begun to flow elsewhere, into ministries, into foreign embassies, into economic forces no corridor could contain. For the eunuchs, this was the most dangerous moment of all. They had survived intrigue, purges, and executions, but they were not equipped to survive irrelevance. A eunuch without access was not merely unemployed, he was unmade. Some tried to adapt, learning the language of reform, attaching themselves to new bureaucratic elites. Others clung to old habits, believing the system would swing back in their favor, as it always had before. Many simply waited, uncertain, suspended between worlds that no longer wanted them. Waiting had always been part of their lives. This time, it led nowhere. When the Young Turk movement weakened the Sultan's authority, the harem lost its political gravity. When constitutional rule emerged, secrecy became suspect. When the empire aligned itself with modern nationalism, figures without lineage became symbolic liabilities. The eunuchs had been useful because they were outside normal society. Now that same quality made them obsolete. And so they vanished, not in a purge, but in paperwork. Positions dissolved, budgets were cut, authority was redefined. The palace world was slowly dismantled, not with rage, but with indifference. The most lethal force of modernity was not violence, it was administration. By the time the Sultanate was abolished in 1922, the eunuchs were already ghosts. No one needed to remove them. They had been quietly drained of purpose. This ending is unsettling because it denies us drama. There is no final confrontation, no reckoning, no confession, only absence. And absence is difficult to narrate. But absence, too, is a historical outcome. The eunuchs disappeared the same way they operated without announcement. One day they mattered. The next day, they did not. The system they served moved on, leaving them behind, like scaffolding removed after construction. Yet scaffolding tells us something important. It shows how a structure was built. The Ottoman Empire did not simply arise through conquest. It was sustained through an intricate internal architecture, one that relied on human beings molded to fit roles no one else could fill. The eunuchs were among the most extreme of these roles, precisely because they sat at the intersection of intimacy and authority. They remind us that power is rarely clean. It is shaped by fear of instability, fear of rivals, fear of the future. And when fear becomes policy, it creates institutions that would otherwise seem unthinkable. The eunuchs were not a historical accident. They were a solution to a problem the Ottomans believed could not be solved any other way. How do you protect a dynasty from itself? How do you manage succession without civil war? How do you control access to the ruler when everyone wants influence? The answer, for centuries, was silence, separation, and sacrifice. And men whose lives were permanently altered to serve that answer. Today, when we speak of the Ottoman Empire, we often admire its longevity. 6 centuries of rule, vast territories, cultural brilliance, administrative sophistication. But longevity has a price. It demands compromises that later generations struggle to justify. It demands systems that prioritize continuity over humanity. It demands people who absorb violence so the structure above them appears stable. The eunuchs absorb that violence, not on battlefields, but in their bodies. Not in public, but in private. Not for glory, but for order. And in doing so, they became one of the most revealing mirrors of imperial power ever created. So this story does not end with condemnation or praise. It ends with recognition. Recognition that behind every empire's grandeur lies an infrastructure of unseen labor and unseen suffering. Recognition that stability often depends on those denied a stake in what they protect. Recognition that power, when concentrated, always seeks intermediaries to shield itself from responsibility. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Harem were those intermediaries. They stood between ruler and ruled, between mother and son, between desire and decision, between life and death. They ruled nothing and shaped everything. And that is why, even after the empire's gone, their story still unsettles us, because it forces us to ask a final, uncomfortable question. If power always needs someone in the shadows to carry its weight, who is carrying it now? When the last light fades from the palace corridors, what remains is not marble or gold, it is memory. Not the kind written by victors, but the kind embedded in walls where footsteps once paused, where doors once opened only for a chosen few, where silence once decided the fate of empires. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Harem left no heirs to defend their names, no memoirs to explain their choices, no monuments proclaiming their authority. And yet, for centuries, nothing moved at the heart of the empire without passing through their hands. They were trusted because they were feared, feared because they were invisible, invisible because the system required it. Empires like to pretend they are ruled by crowns, laws, and armies. But beneath every throne lies a quieter truth. Power survives through control of access, information, and fear. The eunuchs mastered all three. They did not conquer lands. They did not lead charges. They did not wear crowns. And yet, they decided who did. Their lives remind us that history is not shaped only by those who stand in the spotlight, but by those who decide who is allowed into it. That behind every ruler is a gate, and behind every gate, a guard. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The harem stands silent. The corridors are open to anyone who buys a ticket. But the lesson remains. Power still hides behind doors. Access is still rationed. Silence is still weaponized. The eunuchs are gone, but the system that made them powerful never truly disappeared. It only changed its name. And somewhere, even now, history is being shaped not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who decide who gets heard at all.